And great Wednesday, everyone. Welcome to Fully Human Connections. And I'm joined here with my I am King. I'm joined here with my two co-hosts, Kent and Reggie. How you guys doing today?
Doing well. Can't complain. Got a bright sunny day here in Connecticut. Yeah.
Same
Yeah,
here in Baltimore City.
we got beautiful rain going on in Denver. We need it, and it's helping everything grow. So,
I love how you say beautiful rain. You know what I'm
oh, it's
saying?
beautiful. It's so nice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So why don't we begin our Fully Human Connections with how about we share what we're grateful for today?
Hmm,
That's a great way to set the context.
yeah.
So, Reggie, since it's your first time joining us on Fully Human Connections, why don't you start us off with?
Yeah. So I mean, just really basically, I'm grateful to be able to get up early in the morning. Um, there's food in my refrigerator. There are birds outside. When I was washing my face this morning, I looked to my right out a window, and there was a fox trotting down my driveway. Um, I have indoor plumbing, and I get to walk up a flight of stairs and work on my writing, coaching, and meeting with the two of you. So my gratitude is really basic for simple things that I appreciate. I mean, give me indoor plumbing and food in a refrigerator, and I think I'm blessed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kent,
Yeah, gosh, I don't know what I could cover in addition to my friend Reggie, other than the basics are humbling and to be grateful for: breath, water, food, shelter, friendship, connection. Um, yeah, so my kids, all these things are, we are, how does David White say it, Reggie? We are all equal to and part of the miraculous nature of life.
It's close
Something,
enough for me. Yeah.
something like that. Yeah. So how about you, King? What are you grateful for this morning?
well, I'm grateful for my life,
Mm,
my health, the ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have a sound mind. I'm
mm,
grateful for my mother still being alive,
mm.
and still having sound mind and good spirit as well. Then I'm grateful for the infinite possibilities this day is going to provide.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
And so, with that being said, gentlemen, today we're going to talk about in our Fully Human Connection series, we're going to talk about Reggie, you're in the process of writing a book, and we want to talk about how your book that you're writing and how that. 'Cause I think it's a great book. I think I definitely applaud you for taking initiative, having a passion, and then the commitment to follow through on such an important topic. Because I definitely believe we got to look at our narrative. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about what your book is about? And then let's discuss how we can look at building fully human connections within that context.
Yeah. So thank you for that, King. And as most authors, I'm happy to speak about my book. Um, so the title is Healing America's Narratives. There's a subtitle which I'll mention maybe in a few minutes, um, and it basically is the product or the result of my looking at the history of violence, of bigotry, of nowadays an inability to have civil conversations with each other when we disagree, across the spectrum of the history of the country. And
Mm,
more specifically, the subtitle, which I will say now, sooner than I expected to, is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. So, what the book really looks at is those parts of the United States that collectively many of us deny and don't acknowledge and make believe aren't true. And among the traits that I develop in the manuscript are things, and they're uncomfortable to say. A lot of people kind of move away from it or back off. But it's ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, greed, excess, betrayal, um, and bullying. And did I say violence? I mean, because violence is in there too. And what the book does is trace first the history of that through the interactions of the primarily the British, but not only the British, including some French and Portuguese and Spanish, but in the United States, primarily British, with Native Americans, with Africans who were kidnapped and enslaved and brought over here, and who became African Americans. So those two pieces, generally speaking, within those two pieces, and in history, even including in Europe, the subjugation of women, that's a cross-cultural thing. So the U.S. doesn't have any dibs on that particular topic, although we participate in it. And then to bring it closer to the current dates, I looked carefully at the Vietnam War, and then at the post 9/11 war on terror, specifically in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how the threads of ignorance, arrogance, greed, violence, etc., can be traced from the earliest days of the revolution, 1700s, right up through the treatment of Native Americans, Africans and African Americans, women, the Vietnamese people, and the Afghans and the Iraqis, brought full forward into current times, because the 45th president of the United States, and I build this out in one chapter of the book, for me, embodies all of those traits. So if you want to see like one person, embodying ignorance, arrogance, greed, violence, untrustworthiness, and all those other traits, I'm not going to repeat each one of them, in both his candidacy, in his presidency, in his post-presidency, and throughout his adult life, because I grew up in Yonkers, New York, and I grew up watching him as a young heir become famous. He's had those traits his entire life. So he embodies all of that, and his rise in the Republican Party gave us what I call in the book the gift of seeing all of these problems brought to the surface. He didn't create them. In fact, he's a symptom of them. But his presidency allowed, I believe, to paraphrase and flip Lincoln's quote on its head, the worst demons of our nature to surface in American culture, popular culture, and in the government, and throughout America. So I trace all of those elements, and then the last two chapters of the book, I realized, okay, I better come up with at least some possibilities for resolution. And I do that in a really collective way, drawing on some of the best minds and practitioners and teachers that I've known in my life personally, and those that are deceased, that I've read and really have been helped by. So I'll put a period there, because I could fill the hour with talking about the book, and I just want to stop. So that's the essence of it. And in fact, the last thing I will say is that it speaks to, specifically in America, but is globally relevant as well, that one of the keys we need if we're going to resolve the issues in our country and heal these narratives and own the shadow is this collective view of our common humanity. And as the language that Kent and I have been using for a couple of years now, to see each of us as fully human beings, and what that means at home, at work, throughout every moment of our, that we're breathing. So that's really the period there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So with that being said, Kent, why don't you define again for our listening audience what it means to be fully human?
Yeah, well, see if I can make some links here. As Reggie has spent his career writing and coaching and teaching, and my life and career has been spent in the corporate world, attending to the human element of profit-oriented businesses. And as Reggie's speaking to in the collective shadow of the U.S., these elements, I'd say they also permeate corporate culture, because corporate culture is part of that larger context that we all exist within. And so for many times, as leading the people practices and taking care, being a steward of the humanity of workplaces, we haven't been allowed to address or feel some of these traits that Reggie's speaking to. There's arrogance, there's bullying, there's excess, there's fear, there's violence, there's, all these traits exist in a corporate context as well, and we tend not to address them so long as, the profits are good. We kind of, this person's, they're not so great, but gosh, are they productive? Right. And so for me, as I was in that role, I watched the humanity of organizations that have people from all kinds of different backgrounds, generations, ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, family backgrounds, try to come together in some sense of coherence. And it's always really hard because largely, a group will take on the expression of its leader. America and the expression of its last leader are very common. We need to be able to address these darker parts of ourselves and of one another and bring them to light, as Reggie's saying, and have an adult conversation about what we're actually doing to ourselves and one another through the language we use, the way we talk at each other and blame one another and make wrong and, have power over this thing you were talking about with Runa yesterday. And how do we think about power? How much oppression and dominance over the patriarchy, whatever you want to call it. We need to understand that this is part of who we are and we need to talk about it and heal it. So our question that Reggie and I have been really holding over the last few years in this way, I would say it's been a question that's been at the root of each of our work, respectively for our lives, but it's coming together in this moment with this language is, what does it mean for me as an individual and for us collectively to actually recognize our full humanity, that we all have shadow, dark, unwanted, unpleasant, unsavory expressions. Stop pretending that we don't. Right? And so as we learn to embrace our own full humanity, we can then better extend that grace and courtesy to everyone else. And maybe our hope is, our intention is, maybe the violence begins to abate. And we recognize that there's so much more that we have in common that makes us different on the surface. And that our differences really make for the beauty of the full human expression. And so how do we tap into that and bring that forward versus the darker demons? That, what was the Lincoln quote you just said, Reggie?
He said that the better angels of our nature, and I spoke to the worst demons of our nature.
So we're in this inflection point again as a society. If we want to look at patterns, civilizations collapse when their ways of seeing themselves and engaging with one another and the resources they have at their disposal become out of balance and get out of whack. And that's where we are. And so the pattern that we're, the predictable and almost certain outcomes, if we continue in this expression, is not a future that Reggie or I, or King, I would say, in our getting to know you, that's not an expression we care to breathe life into.
Absolutely.
So with our precious breath and our precious language, how do we come together and share in a conversation and create a view and a way of seeing ourselves and one another that's distinctly different than the current expression of humanity? We don't have the answers, but we need to get going in a different rhythm. We need a different cadence and a different beat than one that's just, take a look and pick your data set.
Absolutely. With that being said, I think one of the immediate false narratives, I use the term false narratives, we talk about America's narratives, that comes to mind is this idea that people are monolithic based on their race. That all black people think one way, all white people think one way, because anytime the media shows us an act of an individual doing something to a person that's outside their race, they make it appear as though it impacts the entire, both races in that context through that act. And that because you're black, you got to feel this way about this particular act, and because you're white, you got to feel this way. And I think that's one of the false narratives we function with within the society, and the media, to me, is one that continuously perpetuates that myth, because we all know that we all have folks that we deal with that are outside of our race that we get along with, you know, and that doesn't get talked about at all. I mean, our country's built on our races coming together and it's doing incredible things. So it's like it's not even a secret, but it gets put out there that there's this racial issue. And see, what my summation into that is this is that I believe there's racist systems in this country for sure, right? Whether it's the criminal justice system, the educational system, the healthcare system, but I don't think that everybody who is white is racist. I definitely don't believe that, first of all. And I think that's one of the narratives I definitely want to unpack, because I think that what happens when we see something that, when again, people of different races have a violent interaction or even a verbal interaction that gets blown out in the media, everyone gets into their tribe. And the media wants us to be in our tribes, because that's what sells. And this country always operates off, in the capitalistic world, especially unconscious capitalistic world, it operates off the fact that if there's division, there's going to clicks, there's going to be engagement about those different things, and then that's going to lead to more advertisements and more money. And I think that's where the focus, from unconscious, when you tie it into corporations, come into play. So I just kind of wanted to unpack that initially as one of the narratives that, to me, I think just really stands out. I definitely want to applaud you two gentlemen for uh, getting on this kind of a conversation. I know this is the work you're doing with Fully Human, and this is a book you're writing, Reggie. But by the same token, it's like, I think that if we're going to down ourselves or label ourselves or even aspire to be, depending on where we are, conscious, then to me it's like, well, then we have to pick up the work that's required to be conscious, meaning to be aware of what our actions and or lack of actions are going to produce in this world that we're living in. I like the fact that you said that none of us want to breathe life into a world that exists with all this hate, and we need to have these important conversations. So I think this is a first start, and I think that as we begin down this journey, as you said, we don't have the answers, right? But we're committed to exploring the possibilities of what communicating can come from this. I think that's what's important.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, King, and the way you began that reminded me of, and I'll have to paraphrase here, but in Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he speaks about it from an anti-racist perspective and a racist perspective, but it's really clear that if you're anti-racist, you don't conflate individual behavior with an entire group. So if you see a Black person doing something positive or negative, you don't say, oh, that's what all Black people are like. And if you see a white person doing something positive or negative, I mean, it feels almost insulting to us to have to say this out loud, because it's obvious to some of us. But conflating individual behavior with an entire group of people, whether it's race, gender, orientation, whatever it is an ism of some form, whatever
Right.
the ism happens to be. And either as an umbrella above that or as a foundation below it, there is this common humanity that transcends gender, race, skin pigmentation, orientation, identity, and all of that. Not to dismiss them and say they don't matter, because we differ in beautiful ways, but we have an, I would say, even more beautiful commonality that's species based. But history didn't do a good job establishing that as a common point of entry, and that's we're fortunate enough to have a lot of history to rely on, to look back on. The framers didn't have the Constitution to rely on when they framed it, and they didn't have the 200 plus years of amending it and struggling with it. They had their limitations. So, but anyway, to the point, yeah, conflating individual behavior with a group gets us nowhere, and it's emblematic of ignorance and bigotry, really. So, so I really appreciate the way you started that last piece, and I also think that, yeah, we don't have all the answers. We have some reasonably good directions to move in, though. We know some things that are better than others. Some of them are tactical, some of them are strategic. But I think we do know some things that work better than others. But I don't proclaim to be able to resolve the issue this week. Yeah.
Well, see, I just think that's the to me that's really the crux of the situation is that I think a lot of folks who are on TV nowadays who are talking heads, they try to appear so they have the solution to the problem when all they really giving is their opinion.
Yeah.
And their opinion is definitely couched and generate profits,
Yep.
right? Pushing forth a particular agenda, whether it's, again, MSNBC, whether it's Fox News, whether it's CNN, anytime someone is pushing a particular agenda, we have to be mindful of who wins by that particular argument. If it's not in love, right? And that's where I'm getting with. See, to me, everything really has to center around the word love. If we're really gonna understand it, not just from the noun love, but saying, how do we turn love into the verb and act in love, right? Og Mandino, one of the great sales trainer, once said, "Do all things with love." To me, and when I read that, I really began to sit here and say, "Let me begin to really internalize that," and I began to and question myself and said, if I begin to do all my actions and all my behaviors with that mindset, I'm going to do all things with love. How would they really impact my environment I live in, the people I interact with, my life in general, just in that context, not only when I feel like it, but just have that as a true rule of thought, my guiding principle, my guiding behavior, right? And I know that it's difficult to always be in that space because we're humans. And we're gonna get tested, we're gonna get tried, right? And we have our biases that we grew up in, our past experiences. But to me, that's what separates us from the animals. We have, as Stephen R. Covey teaches us in his book, The 8 Habits, we have these 3 birth gifts, and the first birth gift that we have is the power of decision, the power of choice, right? So we don't have to act off instincts like animals. We have that power to say, I don't want to do that, or I'm not going to do that, right? And I think that's when you begin to see, gentlemen, where I'm really going with this is for me, as we talk about fully human and how I internalize being fully human, is really becoming a self-mastery. Like, to be fully human is a journey. It's not a destination in my mind. It's a path that we seek. And along those journeys, we don't have trials and tribulations, that's going to come at us. But the goal is to say, I'm committed to being fully human. And so,
I want to jump in on this in a sec. Yeah. Finish your thought, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So even though I may stumble along the way, or I may get sidetracked along the way because of whatever life throws at me, I'm getting back on course to be fully human.
You're so spot on, and I just need to presence, us getting to know each other in these conversations. The way you, King, are relating and bringing yourself into this conversation is actually helping me further understand, the conversation that we're in, and how I'll just speak in first person, how I want to hold myself in this conversation. So, what you're speaking to, in my listening of what you're speaking to, is like, well, fully human as a way of being, and fully human coming from love, our highest angels, not our deepest demons. They're both there, but you're speaking to, they're both going to arise. They both, because in our full humanity, the demons and the angels are both there. And so, to your point, we have choice in the matter. Or as Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response lies all of our growth and freedom, or something like that.
Right.
Right. So I can choose. And so, as you were saying, love, I just scribbled this stuff down. Well, what would love be an acronym for? How might we use that? And unpack it a little bit so that it could help us get an action around that. Well, what might that look like? So I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just playing here for our conversation, and I want you all to tear it apart. It's like, well, L. So if I'm at this moment of choice, I'm noticing something's happening. And it's not what I expected to happen. The angels and the devils both pop up. Oh, something's happening that I didn't want to have happen or think was going to happen. I didn't know it was going to happen. I couldn't predict it. I can't control it. What am I going to do? I have choice. So L, how am I going to lead? I can complain about what's happening. I can be at the effect of what's happening, and I can render myself a victim to what's happening. It's my way of relating to what's happening. Lead, create something, right? So that's the L of love. Oh, observe the impact of what you've just said or done. Lead, take action, observe the impact of that action. Verify it's aligned with your values, your intentions, your highest and best, most noble cause or purpose, and evolve as you need to. Lead again, observe the impact, verify it's aligned, evolve. If we're coming from love and we're putting ourselves at choice, this is the work that Reggie and I do with a lot of the folks we work with. Oh my gosh, something's happening. We got all these emotions. All the angels and dragons and demons are going to be around. What are we going to do? Am I safe? How am I going to predict and control what's going to happen next? Am I coming from love or am I coming from fear? Am I coming from being right or am I coming from being of service? Am I coming from a me orientation or am I coming from like how's this helping all of us? The way I see that choice point impacts the way I'm going to think about it and strategize about it, impacts the way I'm going to talk about it and listen to others about it, and impacts the actions I'm going to take or not. And this is what we explore. This is the context and the container. As Reggie was saying, we have some ideas. We have some ideas of how to create a structure, how to create a container that's psychologically safe, that's built on trust and built on actually inviting diverse perspectives to come together so we can get a glimpse of what a whole might be.
Absolutely. And Reggie, before you respond, I wanted to we have Kareem Abdul Salam actually joining us in our conversation as a viewer, and he brought up an interesting point I wanted to bring up here on the screen and actually talk through this gentleman. He says, here's a scenario for your guests. What if generations over 400 plus years, Caucasians were taught, indoctrinated, and forced to believe and read that everything that is light or white is primarily right or inherently correct? Every system perpetuates that vision. So now, on the flip of a dime, every image, transaction in the history is mandated that Black or African, even that name, was provided by people by Leo Africanus, non-white. There has to be exegesis of the problem and an honest. And I guess he got cut off there. But so, gentlemen, what do you all think about this statement? Because again, that's where I would say as we really begin to have these real conversations, that's where we got to look back. I talked about systems before and really how we deal with the racist systems that still perpetrate or dominate our lives. I mean, everything we deal with in this world, as we all know, is a system. And we're just pretty much functioning within these systems. So how do we begin to look at it from a context of changing the narratives so that the systems no longer, I mean, they are producing the results they intended to produce, that they were created for. But how do we change the systems or engage in the conversations that at least talk about possibly changing those systems?
Yeah, so I want to come back to love when we have a chance, but this actually is, it's not so much coming back to love because this is my response can be based on. So I agree with what Kareem has offered here because that was the view. I mean, you want to read a horrible book that's really informative. Read the Lost Cause, I think Regained by Edward Pollock, back in the Civil War days, where he documents why white supremacy is true. I mean, it was written back then, and it's still used as a guidebook by white supremacist groups. So, Caucasians were taught, as Kareem suggests there, that they were in fact superior, across the board. Fortunately, not enough people, but more and more people are beginning to see, and even to say it that way is terrifying to me, are beginning to see that narrative is not true, never was true, but not enough of us see it that way. So to the question around systems, which you raised earlier, King, and in individuals, both have to be addressed. And I don't know a way to change a system yet, except with enough, the right number of individual transformations. In other words, systems, as we talk about them, forget the infrastructure of the electricity coming through the walls or the internet itself, but the systems we're talking about, the legal system, the governing system, the healthcare system, is people. And whether it's 11% or 51% and all the different numbers people put out there, and I'm not a math guy, we have to work both systemically and with individual transformations in love to make this happen. Just individuals shifting, or just an attempt to somehow change a system without individuals, which I don't know how that happens. Neither one of those, in my experience, works. And I'm not a corporate big systems guy. I'm a poet and a teacher and a writer. But it has to be one heart at a time, and working towards systemic change when we have enough hearts transformed.
Yeah, to build off what you're saying, this is a quote. I'm not going to get it exactly right, and it comes from the body of work of Appreciative Inquiry. If anyone's familiar with Dr. David Cooperrider's work, and many skillful practitioners now have contributed to this, human systems grow in the direction that we most study and talk about. So if you look at the systemic racism, that's being spoken to, yeah, those that had at King, as you were saying earlier, oh, I've got media, I get to control the narrative. So those that control the narrative, this is what we most deeply study and talk about. The human systems grow out of that. This is why we're here right now, as Reggie and we've all been talking about. And so as what we're proposing is, well, what if we most deeply study and talk about love for all the living systems of the planet, which we are equal to and part of. And if we're framed in that view, fundamentally, the way we see things and think about things and talk about things is going to have that in it. So let's just continuing to anchor in that, as hard as it is. And what we're doing here, and I think a recent definition of love that I really appreciate came from Thomas Hubel in his work, and collective healing from our collective traumas, which is what we're all dealing with here. Just it's a slight shift in translation and language. Love arises when we accept something that was previously hard to accept. Oh, I actually am bigoted in some ways. I need to look at that, and I need to put love around that to heal it somehow. Heal the person who gave me that code, heal myself and forgive myself for enacting that code that I was given in any ways, and now be committed to giving myself some new code. I'm not going to see whoever I'm bigoted against in that way anymore. That is my new commitment. And I'm more committed to loving this person, this group, this label or generalization that I've ascribed to all people that look, sound, smell like this are like that.
Right.
Well, no, I need to love to help me create some new source code so I can start seeing thinking about speaking towards acting on behalf of folks that were previously really hard for me to do that with. That's love.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let me throw this quote in there from Dr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.,
Hmm.
which I think is really relevant to our discussion right now, and definitely your book, Reggie, as well. And it says, "I'm convinced that if we are able to get, if we are to get to the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, where machines, computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true evolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies." Right. And I mention that because that's what I believe we need to be thinking in those lines of revolution, a revolution of values. Right. And if we commit to that, and that's where I go back to the journey of being fully human, right? And understanding the atrocities that have been done throughout the history and saying, okay, let's look at that. Let's definitely understand it. Let's research it. Let's get clear on it. But more importantly, what can we learn from it, right? And as we begin to, in order to make or shift, put the ship on the right course, let me say it that way, then I think that the real conversations have to be said about that, heal from that, and begin to say, how do we make the world better as a result, right?
Hmm.
And then again, commit to the fact that in the first initial conversations, we're not going to walk away with the solution. So I think that's the most important part, that when people begin this work is understanding that you're not going to solve it in the first conversation, but you have to be committed to saying, I'm committed to exploring this with you for as long as it goes. Because each conversation is going to teach me more about how you think, and hopefully you walk away thinking at least differently than you did before the conversation started. Not necessarily totally to my side, but you at least see it from a different perspective that you did prior to the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the quote from Dr. King, you're just pointing to valuing things over people, valuing the militarism over people, and there was, I forget the second one, I just skipped over that, but that's right at the core there. I mean, and there's no, if you're looking at concrete evidence historically and current affairs, this country, as a whole. Now we can point to neighborhoods where this is different, families where it's not true, here and there, communities. But as a whole, we tend to value profit and things over people. If you look at the trajectory of the nation, there is this, I would say it's a lack of love. And when I that was my attempt to come back to that word. But and so I love Thomas Hubel's quote, Kent, that you shared, and I love Thomas Hubel's work. But I've spent the better part of, I don't know, 20 or 30 years looking for definitions of love that don't say love arises when or love happens this way, but say love is. And were there any working definitions that actually risk providing a real definition? And so I came up with 3, and these have guided me for at least 20 years. And I just want to say them out loud because they, taken together, I feel they're really powerful in no particular order. So from Brother David Stendhal-Rast, who's a Benedictine monk, he's got to be in his 80s now. He said, love is the joyful acceptance of belonging. Right? Now, I'm not going to point to all the ways we can belong to myself, belong to my body, belong to my family, and belonging with this group, belonging with you two men in conversation right now. So that's one, joyful acceptance of belonging. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled and a bunch of other books starting in the 70s, he was a psychiatrist, no longer with us, said, love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. So there's a willingness in love. There's a choice in love. either for myself to make myself better, my own growth, or to help somebody else, to extend myself for the purpose of. And then the last one isn't really a quote, but it's kind of a summary I came to from reading A Course in Miracles, and in Marianne Williamson's book, A Return to Love, that was a commentary on Course of Miracles. And love there is the absence of fear. So imagine or just feel what it feels like in a given moment to have no fear. If you can do that, most of us live in some kind of fear or another. But imagine if all fear fell away, how that would feel. So if I can joyfully accept belonging, will to extend myself, and do that in the absence of any feelings of fear, especially fear of the other, that for me, those three things together, at the intersection of those three, the Venn diagram, that's where love can live. There may be better ways to describe it that I haven't discovered yet, but those three I found to be really powerful. And if I could say just one last piece, and Bell Hooks, and the book is Outlaw something. I'm losing the title of the book, but she spoke about the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement, and how there was too much of just taking care of what was important for me, and how I felt I was being discriminated against, me being whoever was doing the work. And she said, what we need is an ethic of love. And then she called out two groups. She said, so for all of the Black men who are so vigilant and so strong in their fight for racial equality, but who really don't have anything to say about the gender equality of their Black sisters and wives and mothers. And then she called out the white women for all of their energy in the movement for gender and sex equality, but who didn't really understand the plight of their Black sisters who lived at the intersection of both race and gender inequalities. So it was a really articulate statement. He said, with love, you fight the domination across the board for all human beings, and you don't just tick off the box that's most important to you. So that to me was, I think that book was in the 80s or 90s, I forget. But anyway, so that's the riff I wanted to make on love. Yeah.
Well, since we're throwing quotes out there on love, let me throw my quote by Sorkin. let me throw my quote out there by Sorkin. He says that love is the single most powerful force for changing human behavior. Right?
Yeah.
So to your point, and going back to, again, if we do it within love and really truly mean that, right, that's when we can have these honest conversations.
Yeah.
Like I said, I've always felt that, every time, and it's just me personally, I can't obviously speak for every Black man that's out there, but if I come across someone who, not necessarily personally, but some entertainer that I've seen on TV, and he may say something that appears to be a bigoted statement, right? And I definitely see a difference between bigotry and racism for sure. Like I'll give you an example. When Liam Neeson said the comment he made, and he said that when a friend of his, when he was young, and he was living in Ireland, and a friend of his was raped, and it was done, he believed, by a Black man, and he wanted to go through town at that point and kill any Black man he saw on sight because he was just that infuriated. He was that infuriated, and he wanted that revenge. And he mentioned this during a conversation, talk about how much he's grown, and then he was vilified for that. Folks came out and said, he should never said it, and he was attacked from all ends. First of all, he was talking about a feeling, a memory that he had years prior to that, and he's grown from that. And again, I know personally, when things happen and you are in that space of your tribe, and someone attacks your tribe, your first instinct, and that's going off the instinct again, is to sit here and attack anyone that attacked your tribe that looked that way. I want to go at this person, right? Like, for example, again, same thing, as a Black man watching Roots or any slave movie, and you're watching that as a young kid, my instinct is I want to go out and I want to attack anybody white, not necessarily a white person had, on the screen. That was historic. I can't attack them, but it's anybody white, because now my instinct is kicking and my tribe is kicking. And that's what I think that when Liam Neeson spoke of that, that's what he was talking about, how he's grown from that. And so I'm saying all this to say is that's what I want to get to the point where we don't judge folks for statements that they make. 'Cause I know I don't look at Liam Neeson as a racist, as he was coined by that statement, right? He had a bigot mindset at that time, and I think we all have a bias toward one another until we start interacting with one another. I can even take it a step further on a level of when it comes to homosexuality. We grew up in my era where homosexuality in the 70s and 80s, and even in the 90s for the most part, was ostracized, and you didn't deal with any homosexuals. And it was, you know, and it wasn't until I began to become an adult and I began to interact with homosexuals that I began to no longer see them in that label and saw them as a human being. And see, that's my point. It's when you get a chance to start interacting with people and you get around the biases that are there, then that's what I believe things change, especially when your commitment is, I'm going to do everything within love. I'm going to look for the answers within love, right? I can't say that statement and then say, but not for this group of people over here, right? You can't pick and choose. It's love, because at the end of the day, the quest is to be fully human, regardless of your sexual orientation, your gender, your race, your ethnicity. Is to be fully human and to really accept and embrace everything within that. And that for me has been a growth, right? As myself. So I say all that, say just to get, I mentioned all that to get your thoughts on it. If you have any thoughts on that or anything else you wanted to share, the conversation to be building on.
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, the Liam Neeson example, and that's, I think, part of the culture that we need to work around, or not around, but with, is, so there's the example of a guy who makes at least a bigoted, maybe a racist statement when he's young because of his friend being attacked. And then as an older man, he's now in his 70s. I don't know when that recording was fairly recently, I think. He speaks to the fact of his own growth. Now, looking back at that younger man and saying, that was horrible, basically. And so his critics chose to focus on something he said rather than his being, I'll just use the word exemplar, for change and transformation. His narrative shifted. He let go of his cultural givens. Your example of the American culture's growth, and it's ongoing and it still needs to be, around homosexuality, and it wasn't even spoken about when I was a kid. When I was born in 1954, and so in a story like that, shining the light on, look at that example of development or growth or evolution, as opposed to look at what he was back then.
Right.
That's that's a really important point, and I really appreciate your sharing that. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. The ad I would put in onto that is, for me anyway, what helps me love myself and other people more is if I view things, self and others, through a developmental lens. Oh, you were speaking as you were a child that hadn't grown up yet, and you didn't know right from wrong and and now you've grown, you've developed yourself. I acknowledge and I take responsibility for misspeaking and my mistake. And here's what I've learned from that. We're all human, right? We all make mistakes. And so, if we look at Reggie's book, Healing America's Narratives and all of our shadow elements, if we look at ourselves and all of our shadow elements, all the parts that we don't like, when we learn to honor and accept those too, okay, I don't have to pretend anymore. Like, this is just what's so.
Right.
How do we, and let's have a conversation from there without this fear. I love those definitions, Reggie, and the intersection of those three definitions of love. And so our invitation in Fully Human is like, how can we give ourselves choice in the matter to come from that place?
Yeah.
And hopefully we can all learn how to grow into that expression, grow into that embodied expression of, a species that actually comes from love, not comes from violence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But give people a safe space to share what feelings they had in the past without vilifying them and trying to destroy them from a context of, as we say in this culture, cancel them,
Right.
because of where they were at one point in their lives. It's like now, if Liam Neeson was still saying that today, like this is my current state, then that's a different conversation, right?
Mm,
But
mm, mm.
he should feel comfortable to say, here's what I thought, and here's what I'm thinking now.
Yep.
Because I would be more curious if I was the person that was interviewing him and he made that statement, was to say, well, let's talk about what shifted that thinking. At what stage did you begin to shift your thoughts? I would have wanted to spend more time unpacking that, as opposed to, oh well, the soundbite now is Liam Neeson is racist, and so now we got to regulate his movies that he was in now to just coming straight to, streaming platforms, not coming to the big screen anymore because he has this, you know, taint on him for some reason, and he's just one example. But my point is, I think we've shifted to a dangerous part now where cancel is people's default for things that happen in people's past. And it's like, if anyone that was born, I think, prior to 1975, we got some bias in us, right? Male, female, black, white, doesn't matter, and you got some ism in you. You're going to have some sexism in you because that's how the country was. You had to evolve. And so if we're going to hold people um, punishable to where they thought in their past behaviors, then I don't think there's going to be anybody that we can sit here and accept and move on with. But I quote, as we talk about, as we shift now, and with 8 minutes before the hour, shifting to love, but also shifting to forgiveness,
Mhm.
right? Mark Twain once said, "Forgiveness is what the violet sheds on the foot that crushed it. The
Hmm.
fragrance the violet sheds on the foot that crushed it," right?
Mm.
And for me now, we always talk about forgiveness from a context of forgiving someone else for what they did to us, but it's forgiveness for that pain that's in you. That's where I learned that it's forgiveness is more for you as an individual, not for the person that brought trauma or did something, wronged you in some form or fashion. So I just kind of wanted to shift that conversation, but I know we got 8 minutes before we close out, gentlemen. So I know we can't really shift into another conversation and really unpack that, but just let's think about some closing thoughts or, things we want to share with our listening audience as we begin to wrap up this discussion.
Yeah. I'd like to just put one thing out there to clarify what we mean by shadow. Um,
Okay.
and so when I use the word in the book, I use it as a capital S, as a proper noun. In the Jungian sense, it's the part of us that we don't know we have.
Hmm.
It's repressed. It's not consciously, pushed away. We don't know we have it. Now, the word shadow, small s, is often used for the part of me I don't like, my dark side. The side of me that's I'm kind of embarrassed by. It wasn't acceptable to my family of origin. But the way I'm using the word shadow is, it's a part of my psyche that I don't even know is there, and it
Hmm.
has to be uncovered or discovered, and then owned and integrated for me to become whole. So both uses of the word shadow are legit. I mean, the thing I don't like about myself is one, but in the context of the book, it's that piece that I don't know about. I don't see it. It's Robert Bly called it a long invisible bag that we drag behind us. We throw things in as we're growing up, and we just we never know that. We don't do that consciously. We do it unconsciously. So I just wanted to clarify that word. But I think it's important to really know what we mean by the word. Um,
I
so
love that. I
yeah,
love that you did that. Thank you for that.
yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to, my closing thoughts are just always, we started with gratitude, I'll end with gratitude. I appreciate the container we've created here, King. I appreciate Reggie joining the container. I hope we can continue to hold conversations that matter. Reggie's got a great book. How do we do more good than harm in conversations, right? And I think we're putting that to practice here as we note the labels and generalizations and cultural givens and narratives that we all have. And, I think this is a good step forward to create a healing narrative as Reggie's book is addressing as well. So thanks, guys.
Well, I have a question for you both. And my question is there an example of a human being, past or present, that you would say truly exemplifies being fully human?
So I
And
have
and why?
So I have a really quick answer to that, and he's one of my heroes, and I used some of his work in the book, and it's the late Congressman John Lewis, um, because when he was a young kid, his parents were sharecroppers, and he knew he wanted to be a preacher in some ways, even though he never actually became a preacher, literally. But he was preaching to the chickens in in the chicken coop on his parents' property, and then he literally put his life on the line, and this, you know, in the sit-ins, in the freedom rides, et cetera, and got his head cracked open on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and then he went and he served in the United States Congress for I forget how many years, and so he for me showed this full humanity, what he believed in, and he never did it in an angry way. He never pointed fingers at others, even when he was getting horribly beaten and challenged. So John Lewis is I wish I could have met him. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't think of a better example than that. And Reggie, you and I have talked about him multiple times. And part of that, his spirit is alive and fully human in this sense of our beloved community.
Hmm.
And King, it's what I've seen and felt in you and the work you're doing in Baltimore City. How can you help create, give rise to beloved community?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, mine's going to be a quite a shift, gentlemen.
Mm, yeah.
And I would say, and I say this for this reason. I'm gonna create the context first. It's because history does this gentleman a huge disservice, and I admire his actions in the context that he was someone who decided he saw wrong, he saw an injustice, and put his life on the line to fight for that injustice. And that person to me is John Brown, right? John Brown was so much into his religious belief that he said that slavery is such an unjust system that the only way to stop it is violence, right? And what I'm saying as far as him being fully human, because not only did he believe that, but he sacrificed his sons in
Mm,
that belief as well. And that's a whole different level of thinking when you're saying, I'm going to take my sons out here with me, which may destroy my existence here on this planet. There's no more offspring to produce any more Browns. And when you are that committed to something, and history always paints him as crazy and psychotic and out of his mind. And I just think that if we were to stop and really study that man, his his actions, his beliefs, and what would drive a man to that point where you say, I mean, because basically the Civil War was pretty much started based on his actions. He was one of the um, instigators, the initial, I would say, igniters of the Civil War that came from that. And I just wanted to say that because he did it in his interpretation out of love. Now we can sit here, and as they say, Monday morning quarterback and say whether he was wrong or whatever, but that's the existence, and that's the perspective he approached it with. So
mm,
so that's going to be our challenge going forward, gentlemen. We're going to think about every day. We're going to suggest. Well, I mean, every time we do the podcast, we're going to look at identify a person who we
mm.
feel is fully human, and then also define why we feel that person
Hmm.
fits that criteria.
You just created the perfect paradox. So John Lewis has the non-violent in the extreme, and then John Brown, who chose violence because of the extreme of what he was fighting about, and both of those have a certain validity to them. So that was like a perfect bookend. I just love that. Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I've loved the conversation. This has been a great. Again, I feel more fully human every time we engage, and I look forward to the infinite possibilities that this may bring.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, King. Thank you, Reggie.
Yep. Thank both of you, Kent and King. Thank you for hosting this. It's my pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed this. Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. I look forward to next week as well.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
And for our listening audience, that's all work to do all things in love. Let's all aspire to be fully human.